The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Cedar Creek, Texas, where a crowd had gathered around what seemed like an impossible spectacle. There, in the center of the gathering, lay an enormous mule, its massive frame sprawled across the weathered wooden planks of the town's makeshift stage. The animal wasn't dead, but it might as well have been for all the good it was doing anyone. Its legs were splayed at odd angles, and despite being very much alive, it refused to budge an inch, no matter how much coaxing, pulling, or prodding the townspeople attempted. Standing beside this peculiar scene was Martha Blackwood, a woman whose reputation preceded her like a storm cloud. The recent widow of the town's most prosperous cattle rancher, she possessed a sharp tongue that could cut through steel and a wit that had left many a man feeling smaller than a grasshopper. Her black dress, still fresh from mourning, seemed to absorb the Texas heat. Yet she stood there cool as a cucumber, a sly smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she surveyed the growing crowd of curious onlookers and would-be heroes. But here's where our story takes its first unexpected turn. Because this wasn't just any ordinary mule, and Martha Blackwood wasn't just any ordinary widow. The animal lying there so stubbornly was Thunder, a legendary beast that had belonged to her late husband, Samuel Blackwood. Legend had it that Thunder possessed supernatural strength and had once single-handedly pulled a fully loaded wagon out of quicksand, saving an entire family from certain death. Yet now, this same magnificent creature lay there like a ton of bricks, creating what would become the most talked-about challenge in Cedar Creek's history. Martha's voice rang out across the square, clear and mocking, carrying with it the kind of authority that made even the strongest men pause. "If you're so strong, then lift this mule," she called out, her laughter following the words like the crack of a whip. "I've got $500 in gold for any man brave enough and strong enough to get Thunder back on his feet." The crowd murmured with excitement and disbelief. $500 was more money than most of these folks saw in 2 years of honest work. It was the kind of sum that could change a man's life forever, buy him a homestead, or set him up in business for good. One by one, the town's most prominent men stepped forward to accept the challenge. First came Big Jim Morrison, the local blacksmith whose arms were like tree trunks from years of swinging his hammer against red-hot steel. His confidence was evident as he strode up to Thunder, rolled up his sleeves, and wrapped his powerful arms around the mule's midsection. The crowd held its breath as Jim's face turned red with effort, his muscles straining against his shirt as he attempted to lift the enormous animal. But Thunder remained as motionless as a boulder, and after several minutes of huffing and straining, Big Jim had to admit defeat, stepping back with his head hanging in shame. Next up was Tommy Richardson, the town's wrestling champion who had never met a man he couldn't throw to the ground. Tommy was younger than Big Jim, with the kind of lean muscle that spoke of speed and agility rather than brute force. He approached Thunder with a different strategy, trying to get leverage by positioning himself under the animal's belly and attempting to use his legs to lift. The crowd watched in fascination as Tommy's face contorted with effort, his boots digging grooves in the dirt as he pushed with everything he had. But once again, Thunder remained unmoved, as if he were made of solid granite rather than flesh and blood. The failures continued throughout the afternoon. Marcus Webb, the town's most successful merchant, tried his luck, despite his soft hands and expanding waistline, convinced that his business acumen would somehow translate into physical prowess. He lasted all of 30 seconds before giving up, with a pained expression and a hand pressed to his lower back. Even Pastor Williams, driven by what he claimed was divine inspiration, attempted the impossible task, muttering prayers under his breath as he struggled fruitlessly against Thunder's dead weight. As each man failed, Martha's laughter grew more pronounced, and her taunts became sharper. "Is this the best Cedar Creek has to offer?" she called out, her voice dripping with mock disappointment. "Surely there must be at least one real man in this town." Her words stung the assembled crowd, but they also served to draw even more challengers. From the growing audience, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when a figure emerged from the back of the crowd, moving with quiet determination through the sea of faces. This was Jake Thompson, a man whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere of the gathering. Unlike the other men who had tried and failed, Jake didn't carry himself with bluster or bravado. He was a simple farmer who worked a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, a man who had known hardship and struggle every day of his adult life. Jake's appearance was nothing impressive by conventional standards. His clothes were patched and worn from years of honest labor, his hands were calloused and stained with the honest dirt of farm work, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had spent countless hours under the unforgiving Texas sun. He wasn't the biggest man in the crowd, nor the strongest looking, and he certainly wasn't the wealthiest. In fact, most of the townspeople barely knew his name, as he rarely came into town except for supplies and Sunday service. But there was something in Jake's eyes that set him apart from the others, a quiet intensity that suggested depths beneath his humble exterior. As he approached Thunder, the crowd fell silent, perhaps sensing that this attempt would be different somehow. Martha's mocking laughter died in her throat as she watched. This unassuming man kneeled beside her late husband's prized mule. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Creek for generations to come. Jake didn't immediately try to lift Thunder. Instead, he placed his weathered hands gently on the animal's neck and began to speak to him in soft, soothing tones that only the mule could hear. The crowd strained to listen, but Jake's words were too quiet to make out. Whatever he was saying, it seemed to have an effect on Thunder, whose ears perked up for the first time all day. After several minutes of this quiet communication, Jake positioned himself beside the massive animal and, with movements that seemed almost effortless, began to guide Thunder back to his feet. The mule's legs straightened gradually, and within moments, the legendary beast was standing tall and proud once again. As if the entire afternoon of stubborn resistance had been nothing more than an elaborate performance, the crowd erupted in amazement, but their cheers quickly turned to confused murmurs as they realized what they had witnessed defied all logic and expectation. How had this simple farmer succeeded where so many stronger men had failed? What secret did Jake Thompson possess that enabled him to accomplish the impossible? Martha Blackwood stood frozen and shocked, her confident demeanor cracking for the first time all day. She had expected many things when she issued her challenge, but she had never expected this particular outcome. As she stared at Jake Thompson, who was now gently patting Thunder's neck as if nothing extraordinary had happened, she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the approaching evening. The mystery deepened when Jake turned to address Martha directly. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the now silent crowd, "I believe you mentioned something about $500. His tone was respectful but firm, and there was something in his manner that suggested he knew far more about the situation than he was letting on. Martha's mind raced as she tried to process what had just occurred. She had been so certain that no one could lift Thunder, so confident in her challenge, that she had never seriously considered what would happen if someone actually succeeded. Now, faced with the reality of Jake's inexplicable success, she found herself in an impossible position. But the story was far from over, because Jake Thompson wasn't who he appeared to be, and Thunder's sudden cooperation wasn't the miracle it seemed. As the crowd began to disperse and the excitement of the afternoon faded into evening shadows, secrets that had been buried for months were about to come to light. Secrets that would change everything the people of Cedar Creek thought they knew about Martha Blackwood, her late husband, Samuel, and the mysterious farmer who had just accomplished the impossible. The truth began to unravel 3 days later, when Sheriff Coleman made a discovery that would shake the very foundations of the community. While investigating an unrelated matter at the old Blackwood Ranch, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Samuel Blackwood's study was a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of the respected cattle rancher's final days. The papers revealed a web of debt and desperation that Samuel had managed to keep hidden from everyone in town, including his wife. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt. The cattle had been sold off secretly to pay gambling debts, and Samuel had been borrowing money from dangerous men in the neighboring county. According to the documents Sheriff Coleman found, Samuel Blackwood hadn't died of natural causes, as everyone believed. He had been murdered, and the killer was someone close to him, someone who stood to gain from his death. As the sheriff delved deeper into the mystery, he made another shocking discovery. Jake Thompson wasn't a simple farmer at all. He was Samuel Blackwood's illegitimate son, a secret that had been kept hidden for over 30 years. Samuel had set Jake up on the small farm outside town and had been secretly supporting him financially, a fact that explained how Jake had managed to survive on such a modest plot of land. But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. Sheriff Coleman confronted Jake with the evidence he had found. The quiet farmer's facade finally cracked, revealing a man driven by decades of resentment and a thirst for justice that had consumed his entire adult life. Jake confessed that he had known about his father's murder all along, and that he had been planning his revenge ever since. The challenge with Thunder hadn't been a test of strength at all. Jake had been secretly visiting the mule for weeks, training the intelligent animal to respond to specific voice commands that only he knew. Thunder's stubborn refusal to move for anyone else had been part of an elaborate plan to expose Martha Blackwood as his father's killer and to claim his rightful inheritance. The truth was even more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Martha had discovered Samuel's secret son and had used that knowledge to blackmail him into changing his will, leaving everything to her instead of his legitimate heirs. When Samuel had finally worked up the courage to stand up to her and threaten to expose her own dark secrets, she had poisoned him with a slow-acting toxin that made his death appear natural. Jake's plan had been masterful in its simplicity. By creating a scenario where he alone could succeed at an impossible task, he had positioned himself to claim Martha's reward money, while simultaneously demonstrating that he possessed knowledge and abilities that no ordinary farmer should have. He knew that his success would raise questions, and he had counted on those questions leading to the investigation that would ultimately expose Martha's crimes. As Sheriff Coleman pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, he realized that Jake had been gathering evidence against Martha for months. The farmer had been secretly documenting her movements, collecting testimony from witnesses who had seen her near the ranch on the night of Samuel's death, and building an airtight case that would ensure justice for his father's murder. The final confrontation took place in the same town square where the mule challenge had occurred just a week earlier. This time, however, the crowd that gathered was drawn not by the promise of entertainment, but by the shocking news that had spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire. Martha Blackwood, the proud widow who had mocked the town's strongest men, now stood accused of murder, and the simple farmer who had accomplished the impossible was revealed to be the victim's son, seeking justice for his father's death. When Martha realized that her carefully constructed lies were crumbling around her, she made one last desperate attempt to escape justice. She tried to claim that Jake was lying, that his story was nothing more than the fantasy of a delusional man seeking to claim an inheritance that didn't belong to him. But Jake was prepared for this final deception as well. From his pocket, he produced a letter written in Samuel Blackwood's own hand, a letter that acknowledged Jake as his son and expressed his intention to leave him a portion of the ranch. More damning still, Jake had secretly recorded Martha's confession, obtained during a late-night conversation when she had believed herself safe from discovery. As the sheriff placed Martha under arrest, she finally broke down and admitted to everything. The poison, the blackmail, the elaborate deception that had fooled an entire town, all of it came pouring out in a torrent of guilt and desperation. She had never intended for things to go as far as they had, she claimed, but Samuel's stubbornness and Jake's unexpected appearance in their lives had forced her hand. The trial that followed became the most sensational legal proceeding in the county's history. Witnesses came forward to testify about Martha's suspicious behavior in the weeks following Samuel's death, about the strange visitors who had come to the ranch at odd hours, and about the financial irregularities that had gone unnoticed until Jake's investigation brought them to light. But in the end, Martha Blackwood was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, her elaborate scheme undone by the patient planning of the son she had never known existed. Jake Thompson inherited his father's ranch, though much of it had to be sold to pay off Samuel's debts. The remainder, however, was enough to secure Jake's future and allow him to leave his days of deception behind. Thunder, the magnificent mule whose trained performance had been the key to exposing the truth, lived out his days in comfort on Jake's farm, a living reminder of the most extraordinary deception Cedar Creek had ever witnessed. The townspeople never quite knew what to make of the quiet farmer who had fooled them all, but they learned to respect the man who had risked everything to seek justice for his murdered father. Years later, when visitors to Cedar Creek heard the story of the widow's challenge and the farmer's impossible success, they often wondered how different things might have been if Jake Thompson had chosen revenge over justice, or if Martha Blackwood had been content with the considerable fortune she had already stolen. But in the end, the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried, and justice had prevailed in the dusty streets of a small Texas town where nothing was quite what it seemed. The legacy of that day lived on in the memories of everyone who had witnessed Jake's seemingly miraculous feat, serving as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most unassuming person in a crowd might be harboring the biggest secrets of all. The story became a legend passed down through generations, a tale of murder and deception, of patience and planning, and of the ultimate triumph of truth over lies in a place where the sun beat down mercilessly and secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried forever. The courthouse steps of Cedar Creek had never seen such a crowd. News of Martha Blackwood's sentencing had spread far beyond the small Texas town, drawing reporters from Dallas and Houston who wanted to capture the final chapter of what newspapers were calling the Mule murder mystery. Jake Thompson stood quietly among the gathered townspeople, his weathered face showing neither satisfaction nor vindication, only the quiet peace of a man who had finally laid his ghosts to rest. As Martha was led away in shackles, her bearing now broken by months of imprisonment and the weight of her confession, she turned one last time to look at Jake. Their eyes met across the crowded square, and for a moment, the elaborate facade of their bitter game fell away completely. She was no longer the calculating widow who had murdered for money and power, and he was no longer the simple farmer seeking justice for his father's death. They were simply two people whose lives had been forever changed by secrets, lies, and the terrible consequences of choices made in darkness. "I never meant for Samuel to die," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "I only wanted him to pay for what he'd done to me, for all the years he kept you secret, while I played the perfect wife." Jake said nothing in response, but his expression softened slightly, perhaps understanding for the first time that Martha herself had been a victim of Samuel's deceptions. Trapped in a marriage built on lies and half-truths, the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, carrying Martha toward the state prison where she would spend the remainder of her days. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the trial's conclusion giving way to the ordinary concerns of daily life. But for Jake Thompson, the end of Martha's story marked only the beginning of his own journey toward understanding who he really was and what he wanted to do with the truth he had fought so hard to uncover. Thunder, the magnificent mule, whose trained performance had been instrumental in exposing Martha's crimes, had become something of a local celebrity. Visitors from neighboring counties would come to Cedar Creek specifically to see the animal who had helped solve a murder. Though Thunder himself seemed largely indifferent to his newfound fame, he spent his days grazing peacefully in Jake's pasture, occasionally lifting his massive head to regard curious onlookers with the same patient dignity he had always possessed. Jake discovered that owning his father's ranch, even the reduced portion that remained after paying Samuel's debts, came with responsibilities he had never anticipated. The townspeople who had once barely acknowledged his existence now sought his opinion on community matters, invited him to serve on church committees, and generally treated him with the respect accorded to one of Cedar Creek's more prominent citizens. It was a role he had never wanted and wasn't entirely comfortable with, but he gradually learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of small-town leadership. More challenging was the discovery of other secrets Samuel had kept hidden. Going through his father's papers, Jake found evidence of several other children Samuel had fathered over the years, scattered across Texas and beyond. Some were legitimate children from Samuel's first marriage, a union that had ended tragically when his young wife died in childbirth. Others, like Jake himself, were the products of brief relationships Samuel had formed during his frequent business travels. The revelation that he had siblings he had never known about sent Jake on a journey of discovery that took him far from Cedar Creek. One by one, he tracked down his half-brothers and half-sisters, some of whom had grown up knowing about Samuel but had been instructed never to contact him. Others who had lived their entire lives unaware of their true parentage. Each reunion was different, some joyful and healing, others painful and awkward. But all of them helped Jake piece together a more complete picture of the complicated man who had been his father. Sarah Blackwood, Samuel's daughter from his first marriage, had been living in San Antonio, working as a schoolteacher and caring for her elderly aunt. She had always wondered why her father had seemed so distant and preoccupied in his later years, why he had stopped visiting as regularly as he once had. Learning about Jake and the circumstances of Samuel's death helped her understand that her father had been struggling with guilt and responsibility for choices he had made long before she was born. Marcus Thompson, another of Samuel's illegitimate sons, had grown up in Oklahoma, believing his father was dead. The shock of learning not only that Samuel had been alive until recently, but that he had another brother who had been seeking justice for their father's murder, left Marcus reeling, with a mixture of anger and confusion that took months to resolve. Each of these reunions forced Jake to confront the complexity of Samuel's character and the far-reaching consequences of his decisions. Samuel hadn't been simply the neglectful father Jake had imagined, nor was he the heartless deceiver Martha had painted him to be in her bitterness. He had been a flawed man trying to balance competing responsibilities and desires, making choices that seemed right at the time but created problems that outlived him. The most surprising discovery came when Jake found a series of letters Samuel had written but never sent, letters addressed to Jake himself that revealed the depth of his father's love and regret. Samuel had wanted to acknowledge Jake publicly, to bring him into the family business and give him the recognition he deserved as his son. But Martha's threats and blackmail, combined with Samuel's own cowardice and fear of scandal, had prevented him from taking action until it was too late. Reading these letters by lamplight in his father's old study, Jake finally understood the full tragedy of their relationship. Samuel had died not just as the victim of Martha's poison, but as a man consumed by regret for opportunities lost and words left unspoken. The knowledge was both heartbreaking and liberating, freeing Jake from the anger and resentment that had driven him for so many years. As the seasons changed and life in Cedar Creek settled into new patterns, Jake began to envision a different future for himself and the land he had inherited. Instead of simply working the ranch as his father had, he decided to transform it into something that would honor Samuel's memory while creating opportunities for others who had been marginalized or forgotten. The Blackwood Educational Farm became Jake's tribute to his father's complicated legacy. He opened the property to children from poor families, teaching them agricultural skills and providing them with opportunities to earn money through honest work. Thunder, now elderly but still magnificent, became the farm's unofficial mascot, patiently allowing children to pet him and ride on his broad back while Jake told carefully edited versions of the story that had made them both famous. Jake never married, though he formed close friendships with several of his newly discovered siblings and remained an active part of their lives. He found fulfillment in his work with young people and satisfaction in knowing that the secrets and lies that had poisoned his father's generation would not be passed on to the next. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children had gone home to their families, Jake would often walk out to the pasture where Thunder spent his final years. The old mule would amble over to the fence, and Jake would stroke his neck while watching the sunset over the Texas landscape that had shaped so much of his story. Sometimes visitors would ask Jake if he ever regretted the elaborate deception he had orchestrated to expose Martha's crimes. His answer was always the same: he regretted the necessity of deception, but not the pursuit of truth. Justice had required patience, planning, and yes, a certain amount of performance, but in the end, it had prevailed over lies and violence. The people of Cedar Creek never quite knew what to make of their quiet hero, the man who had fooled them all in service of a greater good, but they learned to respect his privacy and his choices. And over time, the sensational aspects of the story faded into local legend while the deeper lessons about truth, justice, and the complexity of human nature became part of the community's collective wisdom. Thunder died peacefully one spring morning, simply lying down in his favorite spot beneath an old oak tree and never getting up again. Jake found him there and buried him on the hill overlooking the pasture, with a simple stone marker that read, "Thunder, a good and faithful friend." The mule's death marked the end of an era, but Jake knew that the story they had shared would live on long after both of them were gone. Years later, when Jake himself was an old man telling stories to a new generation of children on the educational farm, he would sometimes pause in his narrative and look out over the land that had given his life such unexpected meaning. The truth had indeed set him free, but it had also taught him that freedom came with responsibilities, that justice required courage, and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that healed old wounds rather than opening new ones. The legend of the widow's challenge and the farmer's impossible success became a permanent part of Cedar Creek's identity, a reminder that in a world full of deception and pretense, authentic strength often comes from the most unlikely sources, and that patience, combined with determination and a commitment to truth, can overcome even the most elaborate lies. In the end, Jake Thompson had accomplished something far more significant than lifting a stubborn mule. He had lifted the burden of secrets from an entire community, transformed a legacy of deception into one of education and hope, and proven that sometimes the most powerful act of strength is simply refusing to let the truth stay buried forever.